Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer, your reluctant prophet. I have something to be very reluctant about this morning because today's topic is that of democide. That is, murder of the citizenry by their own government. Since the topic of this podcast is that of democide, namely the murder of citizens by their own government, this subject is so dark and perverse that I've only been able to do my research and write about it in fits and starts before I needed to take a break. This episode will prove that the number one source of harm and murder done to the citizenry originates with their own government, who commit atrocities while claiming that their murderous tyranny promotes the good of the many over the rights of the few. Without this lie, the real nature of their anti-human agenda would become apparent, which is why those in power protect this lie at all costs. My research includes a review of the work of the late Dr. Rudolf Rummel, who was an American political scientist and professor at the Indiana University, Yale University, and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dr. Rummel spent his career studying data on collective violence and war, with a view toward helping their resolution or elimination. Contrasting genocide, Rummel coined the term democide for murder by government, such as the genocide of indigenous peoples and colonialism, Nazi Germany, the Stalinist purges, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, and other authoritarian, totalitarian, or undemocratic regimes. Coming to the conclusion that democratic regimes result in the least democides. Reiterating Rummel's conclusion, it is fair to state that a preeminent fact about government, focusing especially on the 20th century, is that many of them murdered millions in cold blood. What's more, tens of millions of additional human beings were slaughtered by governments as a result of foreign aggression and intervention, or war. I add to Dr. Rummel's conclusion on democide the findings of the Commissioner's report of the National Citizens Inquiry, which can be read at the following link. You will find that link in my podcast, or my blog rather, which is always linked. The link to the blog is always included in the podcast, in the notes to the podcast. On Tuesday, November the 28th, 2023, the National Citizens Inquiry released the final report of its months-long investigation into Canada's response to COVID-19. This report follows the September 14th release of an interim report focused on the regulatory approval process and safety of COVID-19 vaccines. The report was written by NCI's 4 independent commissioners: Chairperson Mr. Ken Drysdale, Ms. Heather D. Gregorio, Ms. Janice K. Koken, and Dr. Bernard Massey. The report is the culmination of their efforts to listen to the testimony of over 300 witnesses who told the commissioners and all Canadians what happened to them during the COVID-19 crisis, or shared their expertise on subjects ranging from the economy and education to mental health, medical science to media, institutional censorship to social harms and civic losses, to name just a few. To learn how Canadians were affected by the policies enacted by governments and other organizations in response to COVID-19, recommend ways flip down. Forgive me. Computer's jumpy this morning, so it flipped down. Recommend ways health and other crises could be better managed in the future to reduce and avoid the many harms that Canadians experience since COVID-19 began in early 2020. The commissioners expressed deep appreciation for the individuals and organizations who courageously came forward to share their experiences, expertise, and perspectives, and which led to the report and recommendations now available here. Summary. The National Citizens Inquiry into Canada's response to COVID-19 released its final report on November the 28th, 2023. The report was based on the testimony of more than 300 members of the public and expert witnesses during 24 days of hearings in 8 cities and additional virtual hearings. The report contains hundreds of recommendations impacting all segments of Canadian society. The report describes profound damage done to the fabric of Canadian society and the nation. It documents heartbreaking and deeply shocking testimony from people who experienced adverse vaccine reactions, disruption of livelihoods and education, impaired mental health, reputational damage, professional discipline, and censorship. The report laments that although subpoenas were issued to 63 members of government, regulators, and authorities, urging them to testify, none of them appeared. Not one. The Commissioner's report describes how the widespread acceptance of stringent government lockdowns, which would have previously been deemed inconceivable, represents a remarkable shift within a mere 3 years. The report asserts that the policy, legal, and health authority interventions into the lives of Canadians, their families, businesses, and communities were significant. These interventions have impacted the physical and mental health, civil liberties and fundamental freedoms, jobs and livelihoods, and overall social and economic well-being of nearly all Canadians. The report also criticizes the role that the public and private broadcasters played in terrorizing the public and then merely acting as a mouthpiece of the government who relentlessly pounded Canadians with 24/7 propaganda without questions. There can be no doubt left to any thinking and informed person that the state has exceeded its proper and legal mandate to govern, to become the primary source of murderous tyranny, as it pursued policies that promoted an illiberal, authoritarian agenda that was entirely detrimental to the health, well-being, social cohesion, and economic prosperity of all Canadians, particularly the most marginalized. To be blunt, the greatest enemy we are facing as a nation comes from our own government and its bureaucracy, accompanied by the incredible unwillingness of many, if not most, Canadians to find the political will to remove these corrupt dictatorial oligarchs from power so that they can be held legally accountable for their treasonous, unconstitutional overreach in a court of law, since our overlords have blood on their hands. Experiencing a constant barrage of contradictions from trusted individuals can have significant psychological effects. The human brain is hardwired to seek consistency. When persistent, unresolved internal contradictions arise between people's everyday decisional premises, it can generate mental distress that manifests in mental dysfunction. Many people who are consistently distrusting have good reason for being so. but a tendency not to trust others can have severe consequences in a number of domains, particularly on interpersonal relationships, and can exacerbate loneliness, depression, and antisocial behavior. Anxiety and depression disorders may be a function of unresolved contradictions. Evidence from fMRI lesion studies suggests that anxiety and depression engender contradiction between perfectionist demands and reality perception. Such conflicts in the premises of the person's practical reasoning network generate somatosensory threat feelings. These feelings are conceptualized in terms of linguistic acts of catastrophizing, damning, and thinking that I can't. A logic-based cognitive behavioral therapy can key into the premise of such self-defeating reasoning. Chronic distrust can affect how you view yourself and all the relationships in your life. You might find you frequently doubt other people will come through on their obligations, for example, or you may be afraid of getting too close to others or feel suspicious when someone is kind to you. Certain mental health disorders may involve symptoms of distrust or paranoia, including post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoid personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, psychosis, psychotic disorders, depressive disorders, and anxiety disorders. So here is an article reviewing Dr. Rummel's findings, which is precisely why I do not trust the man, given what those findings state. The unlimited government is not your friend. We must demand restoration of limited constitutional government with rules that permit us to rid ourselves of wicked leaders. For power in the hands of the electorate is essential to peace, order, and good government. This article is entitled Nations Kill a Lot of People by Richard A. Konigsberg and is available at the link I provide, which will be in the blog. From this article that Konigsberg wrote about Dr. Rummel, reviewing the history of the 20th century, nation states have something in common. They killed millions upon millions of human beings. Do we wish to say that each event, each instance of death by government, has a unique or idiosyncratic cause? This mode of explanation violates the principle of parsimony, in other words, of looking for the simplest answer to the question. Although tens of millions of people were murdered by governments in the 20th century, we'd prefer not to consider the possibility that killing or slaughter is one of the basic functions of the nation state. Based on a lifetime of research on democide, Rudy Rummel calculates that for the period between 1900 to 1999, a total of 262 million human beings were murdered by their governments. This figure excludes deaths that occurred based on clashes between armies or direct military conflict. The typical figure for First World War casualties is 9 million dead, and it is estimated that 56 million died during the Second World War. If we factor in other wars during the 20th century, perhaps a minimum of 325 million human beings were killed as a result of collective forms of violence generated by nation states. We omit here in this discussion the wounded. Whatever the exact figure, and whatever descriptive words we use, genocide or war or mass murder or democide, a salient fact of the 20th century is that hundreds of millions of people were killed based on actions undertaken by governments. Based on his research, Rummel concludes that the preeminent fact about government is that some murder millions in cold blood. Historians study specific cases of war, genocide, or mass murder. The search for causes focuses on the origins of the factors leading up to the occurrence of this or that event. A shibboleth of anthropological and historical research and of postmodernism is that each event is unique and can be properly studied only within a particular cultural context. Still, reviewing the history of the 20th century, nation-states have something in common. They took actions that led to the death of millions upon millions of human beings. Do we really wish to argue that each instance of death generated by a government has a unique or idiosyncratic cause? Is this mode of explanation consistent with the principle of parsimony, looking for the simplest answer? It isn't. The orbit of Mercury around the Sun differs from the orbit of the Earth and of that of Jupiter, yet the path of each planet is governed by the law of universal gravitation. We don't yet have a law or principle allowing us to generalize about state collective forms of violence. Still, we can begin to pay attention to, focus our awareness upon, the fact that nation states kill a lot of people. Discussing his bibliography on democide approximately 20 years ago, Rummel explains that he teaches a university course, Introduction to Political Science, and each semester reviews and considers books for an introductory text, the best measure of the state of a particular academic discipline, he says, to use for his course. Rummel shakes his head at what he finds in these political science textbooks. The concepts and views presented in these standard texts appear grossly unrealistic. They do not fit or explain or are even contradictory to the existence of a hell state like Pol Pot's Cambodia and a gulag state like Stalin's Soviet Union, or a genocide state like Hitler's Nazi Germany. One textbook, Rummel says, spent a chapter describing the functions of government. Among these were law and order, individual security, cultural maintenance, and social welfare. Political scientists write like this, even though we have numerous examples of governments that kill millions of their own people and enslave the rest. Presented through the lens of these standard textbooks, politics is a matter of inputs and outputs, citizen inputs, aggregations of political parties, governments determining policies, and bureaucracies implementing it. There is especially the common and fundamental justification of government, that it exists to protect citizens against the anarchic jungle that would otherwise threaten their lives and property. Such archaic or hysteric views, Rummel says, show no appreciation of democide's existence and all its related horrors and suffering. Rummel concludes that we have no concept for murder as a name of public policy, determined by discussion among the government elite and the highest councils and imposed through government bureaucracy. What is needed is a reconceptualization of government and politics consistent with what we now know about democide. New concepts have to be invented. It is true that the field of comparative genocide has recently emerged. Political scientists and historians have begun to recognize that the Holocaust was only one incident of genocide. There are other cases of governments intentionally murdering hundreds of thousands, even millions of human beings. In examining textbooks on political science and government, however, Rummel says that he found in the indexes of these books barely a single reference to genocide, mass murder, killed, dead, executed, or massacred. Most of these texts even omit index references to concentration camps or labor camps or gulags, even though they may have a paragraph or two on these topics. Reiterating Rummel's conclusions, it is fair to state that a preeminent fact about government, focusing especially on the 20th century, is that many of them murdered millions in cold blood. What's more, tens of millions of additional human beings were slaughtered by governments as a result of foreign aggression and intervention, or war. One might say, we spoil the minds of young people, contaminate them by conveying unpalatable facts in introductory texts, which is a way of raising a broader question. Why be concerned with seeking to discover and to convey the truth? There is an abundance of history books studying events that resulted in the death of millions of human beings. The First and Second World Wars and the Holocaust are popular topics. More recently, books on mass murder by communist states, the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia, have become more common. Still, we prefer not to make generalizations. We like to maintain our belief in or fantasy about the goodness of nation states. We live in a state of denial, preferring to maintain our illusions. What would happen if we adopted a posture of looking at the truth rather than one of denial? What benefits would accrue? And he signs off with regards, Richard Königsberg, and then he adds a P.S. I began this inquiry exploring security studies, a field that, beginning with Hobbes' concept of the state of nature, proposes Barry Buzan that states come into being in the pursuit of freedom from threats. The idea or image of a state of nature where unbearable chaos reigns gives rise to states as a mechanism to achieve adequate levels of security against threats. Governments in the state are born with individuals when individuals are willing to sacrifice some freedom in order to improve levels of security. But there is no evidence of the existence of a state of nature. The theory is pure conjecture, if not fantasy. As for the proposition that states provide security based on the evidence presented here, the less said, the better. End from that article. I find Rummel's views on the following particularly compelling, given the effects of COVIDianism and net zero carbon emissions on individual well-being, the well-documented effect of lockdowns and masking and distancing mandates on the psychological well-being of children, the bank industry's propensity to print money out of thin air to fund illiberal authoritarian policies, and the incredible damage to civil liberties as indicated by the sheer number of cases before the courts where the state is being sued for governmental overreach. So let's examine morticide. While democide requires governmental intention, Rummel was also interested in analyzing the effects of regimes that unintentionally, yet culpably, cause the deaths of their citizens through negligence, incompetence, or sheer indifference. As an example is a regime in which corruption has become so pervasive and destructive of a people's welfare that it threatens their daily lives and reduces their life expectancy. Rummel termed death of citizens under such regimes as morticide, and posited that democracies have the fewest of such deaths, unless, of course, you're talking about Canada. Famine, economic growth, and happiness. Rummel included famine in democide, if indeed it is the result of a deliberate policy, as he did for the Holodomor. Rummel stated that there have been no famines in democracies, deliberate or not, an argument first advanced by Amartya Sen, and he has also posited that democracy is an important factor for economic growth and for raising living standards. And by democracy, we're talking about governments that answer to the will of the people, not what is happening in this country, where the government no longer answers to the will of the people. He stated that research shows average happiness in a nation increases with more democracy. According to Rummel, the continuing increase in the number of democracies worldwide would lead to an end of wars and democide. He believed that goal might be achieved by the mid-21st century. So I've had AI generate a little review of Rummel's work. AI entitled it The Power of Democracy, an examination of Rudolf Rummel's political position. Introduction. Rudolf Rummel, an American political scientist, dedicated his career to studying collective violence and war with the aim of helping their resolution or elimination. He is known for his research on war and conflict resolution, and his work has significantly influenced the field of political science. Subtitle: Rummel's political position. Rummel started his career as a democratic socialist, but later became an anti-communist, a libertarian, and an advocate of economic liberalism. His political position is deeply rooted in his belief in the power of democracy and its ability to prevent violence and foster peace. Democratic peace theory, next subtitle. One of Rummel's most significant contributions to political science is the democratic peace theory. He argued that democratic states are less likely to engage in mass violence or wage war against each other. This theory suggests that the more democratic a regime, the less likely it is to engage in violence, genocide, and mass murder. Democracy is a means to wealth and prosperity. Rummel also believes that democratic freedom is not only a method of nonviolence, but also a means to wealth and prosperity. He argued that the power of freedom to improve human affairs extends to social and economic development. Conclusion. Rudolf Rummel's political position emphasizes the power of democracy in preventing violence and fostering peace, prosperity, and development. His work provides valuable insights into the role of democracy in shaping a peaceful and prosperous society. So my conclusions, as we draw this to an end, and you might not like them, maybe you will. I'm calling for a national day of repentance. In the absence of God, we have made an idol of the state. It has become a metastasizing monster, not merely capable of all manner of causing us harm, but doing so under the guise of pursuing a progressive agenda. Unless your idea of progress is the death and illness and the ruin of the lives of innocents, we must face the fact that without God, the God of this world will assume the role of governing us by creating murderous hell on earth. From the New King James Version of the Bible, Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 19. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. These are things to think and pray about on this very serious topic. I hope you'll join this discussion and join me in prayer. God bless you.